All right, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the Climate and Racial Equity Forum hosted by the State Water Board. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. All right, so my name is Molly Williams. I'm an environmental scientist at the State Water Board with the Office of Public Participation. And I'm going to be one of your co-facilitators today, helping kind of keep things on track. I'm also managing the Zoom. So if you have any technical issues, feel free to chat me. And I'm going to go over really quickly our logistics for being part of this meeting today. So if you're hearing me, you're either on the Zoom or you're watching us on the Cal EPA live stream. So in order to participate in the Q&A later today, you will need to be on the Zoom. And if you're watching the live stream and you want to be part of the Zoom and be able to engage with our panelists and presenters today, you're welcome to still register and join the meeting. So the link is right here on the screen, and we'll put that up later as well. And we'll also make sure that you're able to join the meeting before then. So that's bit.ly/CRE-Zoom. And if you're part of the Zoom, you can ask questions either verbally by raising your hand or through the Q&A box. And we'll again revisit that later. We also have both Spanish and English webcasts available at video.calepa.ca.gov. So if you want a watch only option, that's available to you too. And after our workshop and forum today, we're going to have the recording in English and the recording in Spanish, as well as the slides available on the website. So because we did have a last minute request for interpretation for this forum, we weren't able to translate the slides in time, but we will have those posted online after the fact. Okay, but we do have our wonderful Spanish interpreters here today, Andres and Giselle. And I'm going to quickly go over how to listen in on the Spanish channel in English, and then we'll pause and have Andres give the overview of how to participate in Spanish on the main channel, and then Spanish speakers can go ahead and switch to the Spanish channel. So if you would like to listen in on the Spanish channel today, you can click on the globe icon down on the toolbar of your Zoom screen, and that will allow you to select either Spanish or English. And English is also on the original audio, so if you're good with that, you can just leave it as is. And to switch to Spanish, you can click Spanish, and then if you don't want to hear the English also in the background, you can mute the original audio. Okay, and I'll allow Andres to give those instructions on the English channel. Oh, Andres, I think you're on the Spanish channel, perhaps, because we can't hear you on the original audio. Let's see. Okay, on the original? Just give us a second. All right. Okay, great. Yes, just click on English to hear the instructions and then click in Spanish. So go ahead, Andres. Great. Thank you so much, Andres. So if you would like the Spanish channel, go ahead and switch there, and we'll go ahead and go to the next slide. All right. So this is just a quick overview. Chris is going to go a little bit more in depth onto this, but our forum today is focused largely on hearing from climate and water researchers and advocates as we begin making these decisions at the Water Board. So we're going to start with an overview of the State Water Board Climate and Racial Equity Strategy, or CARES. We're then going to hear from Shireen D'Souza from Cal EPA for opening remarks. We're then going to hear from our research panel, followed by our advocacy panel. After that, we're going to take a quick break, followed by a discussion amongst the panelists, and then ending with an audience Q&A. And we will adjourn by 4 o'clock today. All right, and with that, I'm going to go ahead and pass it over to Chris Yun, who's going to give an overview of the CARE strategy.
Hi, I'm Chris Hyun, State Water Board Climate Lead. I'm going to give you an overview, but first I'd like to tell you a bit about myself. Next slide, please. So I went to high school in an unincorporated area of California where water was not drinkable. So I hauled drinking water to our house. I moved to India where I worked on water and sanitation. After that, I went to grad school at Berkeley, and in 2020, I became the State Water Board Climate Lead. I was also on the team that drafted the Racial Equity Action Plan, which includes a commitment to address climate. Next slide. Now I'm going to give you some context for today's forum. First, I hope to inspire you with our climate vision. Then I'll give you a crash course on our climate and equity commitments. That'll lead me to the climate and racial equity strategy. And finally, I'll explain what we'll do for the rest of the forum today. Next slide. I'll keep it simple. Climate change is urgent. We need to do more. Temperatures are rising. Next slide. Higher temperatures lead to sea level rise and weather whiplash, where we swing between hazards like extreme heat and storms, drought, wildfires, and flooding. These impact infrastructure, people's health, and the environment. Next slide. Now, some communities are more at risk than others because they have fewer resources to cope with climate change. On this slide, the red areas are more vulnerable to climate change, according to one framework. You can see more red states in the Central Valley, Inland Empire, parts of Northern California, and some in the Bay and LA areas. Next slide. As a state, we need to partner with and help vulnerable communities to become more resilient. This is our vision and why we're doing this forum today. Fortunately, the water boards have started working on this. Now, let me give you a little crash course on the commitments that have led to where we are today. Next slide. Starting way back in 2007, we adopted a series of resolutions to address climate change and incorporate racial equity. Next slide. Building on those resolutions, State Water Board staff released our Racial Equity Action Plan in January 2023. This is a state water board plan. We also have regional boards, and some are working on their own equity resolutions and plans. For this State Water Board Racial Equity Action Plan, there was extensive public engagement with remote and in-person workshops across the state. And State Water Board teams are just now starting to work on implementing actions in this plan. Next slide. A couple of those actions include identify potential disproportionate climate effects on Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities, and recommend solutions related to state water board authorities where possible. These actions are now what we call the Climate and Racial Equity Strategy, CARES, or CARES. And today's forum is the kickoff for the public process to develop CARES. So that was my crash course on our commitments. But now, what is CARES all about? Next slide. So we're still in an early stage of putting CARES together, but we've already started talking with various advocates and have some fundamental CARES principles. One, on one hand, we understand that climate impacts are urgent. Two, but on the other hand, we cannot do everything. So we need to set realistic goals and make sure we don't overpromise and that we work within Water Board's authority. The Water Board, for example, can affect some parts of the water sector, but not all. For this, we need to take time for analysis and public engagement. Next slide. Now that we've gone over CARES principles, what do we hope to do with CARES? This figure shows 4 activities of CARES. The main activity is for staff to recommend climate actions. That's the green circle in the middle. Ultimately, the State Water Board will decide which actions to implement and when. We aim to have draft recommendations by early next year and evaluate and update them regularly. But before that, we need to figure out what our recommendations will be, and we'll do that through 2 ways. The first way, in the blue box, is learn by doing. Learn by doing is an internal process where staff immediately start assessing programs to improve. We have already started discussing with division heads to choose a few programs. This learn by doing process is quicker and helps address the urgency of climate change. The second approach, in the yellow box, is to develop a decision framework informed by public engagement. This is slower, but will help us meaningfully incorporate community needs. A framework would apply to multiple programs, helping us to scale up our efforts in the future. There are many climate risks and community needs to address. Figuring out how to consider these needs across many programs is the purpose of the framework. Next slide. The decision framework will help us figure out what are disproportionate climate impacts and which needs should we focus on. So far, we think there should be 4 considerations to help us answer these questions. They're like 4 puzzle pieces. The first piece we need to consider are Water Board's programs. There are about over 100 programs. The second piece to consider are climate risks, like sea level rise and drought. The third piece to consider are community needs. So far, we've heard many needs during workshops and board meetings. The fourth puzzle piece to consider are population data, like race and income, and at different scales, like census tracts and watersheds. All of these puzzle pieces can be put together in different ways to help us answer these questions for any Water Boards program. Next slide. Today's forum is the kickoff of our public engagement process for us to learn how we should put these pieces together. We are considering hosting public activities like small focus groups, large community forums, and workshops with board members. Input we receive today will inform our next steps for public engagement and the development of the decision framework. Our goals are to engage the public early in our process, to focus on highly impacted communities, as well as find new and underrepresented voices. Next slide. To kick off this process today, we have 2 panels, a research panel followed by an advocacy panel. Some panelists are new to the Water Boards. Each panelist will do a 5-minute presentation followed by prepared questions. After the panels, we'll take a 10-minute break and come back for a guided discussion between the 2 panels. Then we'll have time for audience questions. Again, all of this is to help inform the early development of the Climate and Racial Equity Strategy, or CARES. Just to make clear, our guests are speaking for themselves and their organizations, and not for the Water Boards or any board member. That said, we're glad to hear from a range of people and perspectives. But first, we're going to hear from some familiar voices, our leaders in Cali, PA, and the Water Boards. Before we bring on Shireen D'Souza, I'd like to acknowledge any state or regional board members in the Zoom. I know that board member Nicole was planning on attending. I'm not sure if Board Member Nicole Morgan was able to make the Zoom. All right, it looks like not. Are there any other state or regional board members in attendance? Possibly if you could put it in the chat so we can find you.
Denise Kadara from Region 5 has her hand up.
Great.
Denise, go ahead. You should have the ability to unmute yourself.
Oh. All right, Nicole, if you're there, please do raise your hand. Board Member Morgan. Okay, look, looks like we have Monica Hunter from Region 3, John Skindura from Santa Ana Regional Water Quality Control Board. Welcome to these board members.
Here's Nicole.
Board Member Nicole Morgan, are you there?
I am. Thank you, Chris.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Apologies for earlier. I could not unmute. I just wanted to say thank you for hosting this afternoon. I want to thank all of our panelists and regional board members for also joining us. And so I am here to listen and to learn, and want to just thank everyone also in the public for joining us today. And, for this important discussion, just as we continue to implement and engage around our racial equity resolution and our action plan. This is a critical step in taking a look at how climate change is going to impact our vulnerable communities, and listen to the research panel and advocacy panel and hear from their perspectives of what actions can we take as we continue to implement this important role within racial equity and environmental justice. So thank you all for being here this afternoon. I am happy that I was able to join you and to listen and learn.
Thank you so much. And for the sake of time, I'll give a shout out and welcome our other board members and board from other regional water boards, including Norma Camacho from the LA Water Board, and Rachel Kavanaugh also from the LA Water Board. So welcome again to the board members and various state water board and regional water board staff. So I'd like to continue on and welcome Shireen D'Souza, Cal EPA Deputy Secretary for Climate Policy and Intergovernmental Relations, to share some opening remarks. Shireen, if you can come onto camera, great. Welcome.
Thanks, Chris. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Chris, can you hear me okay?
Yes, I can.
Okay, great. Hey, it's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today for this super important work. Big thanks to you, Chris, to Molly, to James, and the entire water boards team for bringing us together and for the work you're doing to advance climate and racial equity. Today's discussion truly couldn't come at a more critical time. We know that climate change is affecting communities and parts of the water sector in different ways, and tends to disproportionately impact Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities with fewer resources. The equity dimensions of water and climate resilience should certainly always be top of mind, as some of our state's most vulnerable communities still struggle to access clean, safe, and affordable drinking water. With no action, these disparities will be exacerbated and compounded by hotter, drier weather, which could reduce California's overall water supply by up to 10% by 2040. And that's not to mention the more intense and unpredictable flooding as we've seen this past winter, also affecting our water systems. But we're also on the cusp of some of the most significant investments in water infrastructure in our state's history to diversify and protect our water supplies for all Californians. That makes this discussion we're having today all the more important. Now, the big picture situation is that as a state, we're taking strides to tap into the hundreds of billions of dollars in federal funding for infrastructure projects made available through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investments and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. Much of this funding is available for projects that mitigate the impacts of drought and invest in the resilience of water systems. The IIJA is the single largest federal investment in water ever seen in the history of the US. In short, it's a major opportunity to turbocharge our ongoing work to ensure that every Californian has access to safe, clean, and affordable water. It's important that California take the opportunity to set in motion a pipeline of major projects that will help us make the most of our water resources in the future. Barely a week ago, the governor signed legislation accelerating projects that will capture and store enough water to supply millions of Californian households. These procedural changes are key to allowing California to tap into the IIJA and IRA, since federal funding is often a use or lose deal. We've also made unprecedented commitments to invest state budget funds in water and drought resilience. The California Climate Commitment invests more than $3 billion over 6 years in drought response and resilience investments. As we embark on this major infrastructure journey, advancing equity is a top priority. With each dollar spent on climate action in California, we need to make every effort to mitigate the disproportionate impacts that disadvantaged communities and communities of color face from climate change. These inequities span every metric of climate change, including household water insecurity, as much as air pollution burden and exposure to various other environmental contaminants. And we recognize the need for climate action to mitigate the cumulative impacts that environmental justice communities have experienced over time, especially in light of the historical inequities in our state's environmental protection work. In California, we've been on a trajectory of increasing integration of equity imperatives into state government climate action for over a decade now. I'll give you a couple quick examples. Hundreds of state government climate programs have been directed to prioritize disadvantaged communities in their implementation. The California Climate Investments Program is furthermore required to invest 35% of cap and trade proceeds in disadvantaged communities and low-income communities. We've also been examining the potential for setting an ambitious equity target for the state's climate budget overall. And at the federal level, the Biden administration's Justice 40 initiative has set a goal for 40% of IIJA funds to flow to disadvantaged communities. And although action on our equity imperatives has accelerated under Secretary Garcia's leadership at Cal EPA, we know we have much more work to do. We also know that macro level targets and guidelines are meaningless without deep attention to detail at the program level in consideration of implementation practicalities. Stakeholder consultations and community engagement at every step of the way are part of how the state keeps itself informed and helps us adapt our work as the dimensions of inequality evolve. So again, thank you for being here today to provide vital input that will help inform the development of the Water Board's climate and racial equity strategy, a critical part of our state's journey towards equitable climate action and ensuring a resilient water future for all Californians. Thank you again. Have a great meeting.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shireen D'Souza, Deputy Secretary, for those remarks and to understand what Cal EPA is doing in terms of climate. Deputy Secretary and I have regular meetings with other Cal EPA secretaries and staff to make sure that we are aligned in terms of climate as well. And so it's great to have you come and to our event. Thank you. In the interest of time, we will now move on to our next section, which is the first panel, and that's the research panel, and I will be monitoring. And just so that everyone understands how we'll do the research panel, each panelist or team will do a 5-minute presentation that focuses on research that can inform the development of the climate and racial equity strategy. If there is time after the presentations, then I'll ask the panelists questions, and then we'll move on to the advocacy panel. So first up on the research panel is Khalid Osman from Stanford, After them will be Sam Sandoval from UC Davis, and from the Toxic Tides Project, Laura Cushing, who will be presenting, and Seiji Karasaki, who will join later during the discussion, and Amanda Fensel from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Khalid Osman, please, I see that you have your video on. Paola will be advancing the slides for you. I'll let you know when you have about a minute left for your presentation by turning my camera on. So please start with a quick introduction.
Sure. Thank you, Chris. Hello, everyone. My name is Khalid Osman. I am an assistant professor of civil and environmental engineering at Stanford University, where I started last September. And my work focuses really on operationalizing equity and justice in water infrastructure systems, particularly on the provision of water to household services. So we'll go on to the slide. So just to start off, I wanted everyone to stop for a second and think about all the different ways that we interact with our water systems, and just to understand how important water is to our functioning as a society. But we also are reminded that, water is not only a technical system, but a socio-technical system. And so my research really focuses on designing these systems so that they consider human, social, and organizational factors in addition to technical factors. And so for instance, thinking about how people perceive their infrastructure and how people use their infrastructure, and how we can integrate that into our design practices. And so I wanted to go over for today's presentation a quick study that I did a few years ago, and then I'll talk about some paths forward. So if we can go to the next slide. And so I was finding that there wasn't really a clear and consistent definition of how water providers define equity. And so I developed a short survey and some semi-structured interview questions to really get at the heart of, how does your organization define equity and consider equity? And then also looking at, what are the barriers in your organization to incorporating equity or equality in your decision-making processes? And if we go to the next slide. So what we see is that the results from the survey show that, when we triangulated our results, we found several key areas where water providers felt that they could incorporate equity. And so we developed a really simple definition. And, the definition we developed is the provision of a consistent minimum quantity and quality of water to all end users determined at the local level. And why we chose to go with the more simple definition, you can see from the 4 text boxes I have around my main text boxes, everyone sort of had a vague or unclear definition of what equity means for providing water services. And we couldn't really identify where those vertical levers for incorporating equity were. And so the point of this study is identifying areas. And as you can see here, the fiscal environment, organizational management, looking at the regulatory environment, focusing on health and safety, looking at our water workforce, looking at things like project level decision-making and our physical infrastructure attributes and where they're located, how often they're being operated and maintained, and which communities are we focusing a lot of that energy. And then community engagement and how significant sociodemographics are also came up. One of the things that came up often was also that equity is not considered or defined at a lot of water providers across the US. So if we go to the next slide. So one of the things that we found when we were looking at how organizations defined equity versus how they considered them, we saw that there was, in almost all of the respondents, they discussed the significance of sociodemographics. However, in their considerations, not one respondent mentioned it. And so this shows that there's sort of this misunderstanding within organizations in that they don't know how to consider sociodemographics. And I don't believe this is nefarious. It's rather structural. In a lot of engineering organizations, we're not really taught to think about sociodemographics in our education, in our workforce training. And so a lot of the aspects of how sociodemographic composition may impact our functions are not very clear to engineers. And I think that's where my research tries to come in and see if we can metricize and create accountability across a lot of these things. And so I just want to go to my last slide, which is focused on bridging, organizations, policymakers, communities, and engineers together to really go from anecdotal to empirical. And what I mean by that is right now, we have a lot of anecdotal evidence from communities who are dealing with poor water quality or inconsistent water pressures and other water infrastructure related issues. However, we haven't taken that from an anecdotal perspective to an empirical one where we can start attaching quantitative measures. And I think that's the next step when we're thinking about planning for the next several years. We need a lot of data and empirical measures to begin going from anecdotal to empirical. And so the other key piece I wanted to mention here is that, we have over 50,000 water systems across the US. And so localization of equity is really critical when we're thinking about successful implementation. And a lot of these tools that we're developing are going to require data. And so thinking about how to collect that data and be transparent in that data is going to be important. And then the last thing is that ensuring underserved communities have the knowledge and capacity necessary to apply for all these funding resources that was mentioned by the previous panelists. So that's the end of my presentation. I'm happy and excited to answer questions during the Q&A session.
Thank you so much. It is helpful to understand there are a variety of ways of understanding equity and how organizations can move forward in defining that. I would now like to give the time to Sam Sandoval from UC Davis. Thank you so much.
Hi, thanks, Chris. Thanks, everyone. My name is Samuel Sandoval. I'm a professor, extension specialist at UC Davis. And I'm really happy to be here. So could you go to the next one? I want to talk about the invisibles. And I was thinking when I was talking about the invisibles is the people who build and fix our homes, who cook our food and restaurants, who clean our rooms at the hotels, who fix our cars, who make sure that we have internet and electricity, but sometimes those who don't have access to water. Specifically, I want to talk about the our farm workers, the people that grow our food. However, sometimes they don't have even access to the food, and also making the difference between farm workers and farmers. Farm workers are those that you're seeing in those pictures. Farmers typically are the landowners or the people working for certain corporations that actually hold the land, but they are not the ones doing that. So if you can go to the next one. So could you hit, there you go. So in terms of that, we've been doing some work related with that. So one of those is a climate smart, culturally adequate, low water intense crop, such as agave. And in that one, what we're doing is what you're seeing there. Actually, I'm gonna leave on the chat the links of many of the products that we've been, let me see, that we are putting in that one. That is basically for the guidelines. You're gonna see that one in English and Spanish. Basically, what we are trying to do is not only to make or to work on crops that are culturally appropriate to maintain agriculture, and in this case, Hispanic workers doing that. Now, the other one that you're seeing there is food sovereignty. Basically, if you can click enter, what you're gonna see is that we're doing some work actually about aquaponics, so growing fish and food. And that is to actually provide, go back one, to provide our farm workers with access to food. It is very difficult or heartbreaking to see that the people that are growing our food are the people that have a greater risk of being in hunger. So working with some of them to actually improve their access to food. Could you go to the next one? This one is related with the human right to sanitation. And in that one, basically what we're trying to do is wastewater needs assessment. This is a project that just started July 1st with the waterboards, and trying to understand the extent and the type of sanitation systems. If we have wastewater treatment plants versus septic tanks, those that are at risk of failure or that they have already failed. And specifically for that one, what I would say is that I will leave on the chat the contact information of the different people for the aquaponics and this one. Now, The last one that I want to talk is some work that we're doing with an educational institution that is called Water Education for Latino Leaders. And in this case, it's a professional program development for Latino leaders. And leaders is any person that can provide service to the community. So anyone can be a leader. And a person that is serving a Latino community, which in California is pretty much everyone. So this is, well, it has the Water Education for Latino Leaders. It's pretty much anyone in California that wants to provide service. And in this case, a Latino community is in there. The picture that you're seeing there is the training for elected officials. We are training elected officials in a program that is called Well Untapped. And in this one, what we are trying to do is to provide tools to decision makers so they can make more informed decisions. We're looking into a program through the California legislature to do workforce training, but specifically for Black people of color personnel working in the water system. So could you go to the next one? Something that we've been discussing is to have, when Chris asked me about how to do some of the prioritization, I brought this example, and this example is basically a consensus project that I worked for environmental flows between Mexico and the United States. And basically what you saw in there, or I can also put the link in there, we defined targets, we identified our drivers, we came into a consensus for, in that case, it was especially in interest area. I think we have here 4 different already identified topics. Then we went again and tried to prioritize all the laundry list of things that we were considering important. And then basically we built a consensus. So I just wanted to make sure that in that picture at the bottom, when you see anyone holding a green card, is because people approve or did that consensus. So anyway, it is possible to get consensus around scientists. And with that, that will be it for me. I'll leave a lot of the information on the chat, and thank you for having me.
Thank you so much, Samuel Sandoval. This is a great framework that we could consider and learn from. And also, I love the human right to water and sanitation. That was what I studied before my grad studies. So thank you so much. I'd like to now have Laura Cushing from UCLA to begin her presentation. And please start by introducing yourself.
Hi, thanks, Chris. I'm Laura Cushing. I'm an assistant professor in environmental health sciences at the University of California, Los Angeles. Thank you so much for the invitation to hear from, it's a treat to hear from this panel, and I'm really looking forward to the next panel as well. So I'll be presenting on behalf of a collaborative project called Toxic Tides. This was a collaboration between academics and environmental justice and public health leaders outside of academia. So University of California, Los Angeles, also Berkeley and Climate Central, and then the Asian Pacific Environmental Network, Public Health Institute, CAUSE, Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles, and We Act for Environmental Justice. And the motivation for this project was that, of course, the sea level is rising due to climate change. And on the coasts of California, we have a lot of infrastructure. Well, we have a lot of people living near the coast and a lot of history of industrialization and military sites on the coast. And so, and we know from extreme flood events in other parts of the country that during flooding, sites that use hazardous materials often have accidental or even intentional releases of toxic materials to prevent more catastrophic flooding, to do shutdowns or startups pre-post flooding, or through, slower processes like corrosion and infrastructure damage. So the objectives of this project were to estimate flood risks at potentially hazardous sites due to sea level rise across California, identify threatened communities and share our findings through online visualization tools, which I'll be showing you in a moment, which are available in English and Spanish. Next slide, please. In brief, we had a collaborative research approach. So the members of the sort of scientific team, you can see pictured here on the left, we got together with several environmental justice and public health experts to conceive of the project and secure funding for the project. And then we used several existing secondary data sources on the location of potentially hazardous sites, probabilistic measures of flood risk projections under different greenhouse gas emission scenarios, and two timeframes, 2050 and 2100. And then we used a few different data sources to derive indicators of community marginalization across neighborhoods that might be impacted. And there was sort of an iterative process of feedback between the research team and the environmental justice and public health collaborators, whereby we would propose materials and create preliminary results, get feedback from our partners, and then revise with that feedback in mind. Next slide, please. Oh, okay. I think I sent you the wrong set of slides. Sorry about that. Or no, this is right. Okay. So in brief, what we found with this project is that, and here I'm just sharing sort of a snapshot of some of our findings. Looking at the end of the century, if we continue to emit greenhouse gases sort of at the rate that we're doing under a high emission scenario, we projected at least 425 sites were at risk of surface flooding. And you can see the different types of sites that we looked at in this pie chart. If you're not getting too distracted by the little GIF on the right, if you did look at the pie chart in the middle, you can see we looked at power plants, CAFOs, which are concentrated animal feeding operations, sewage treatment plants, sites dealing with hazardous waste, etc. You can see the list there. And we found that marginalized communities were more likely to live near at-risk sites. So we looked at various metrics of marginalization. One of them, the CalEnvirus Screen score, communities designated as sort of disadvantaged using CalEnvirus Screen were 6 times more likely to live within a kilometer of an at-risk site than communities not designated as disadvantaged, as according to CalEnvirus Screen. And we had sort of a 2-tiered dissemination strategy. So we published these findings in a peer-reviewed scientific journal, which is open access, but probably most people will find much too dry to read. And then we also created this website here. You can see the URL where there are maps, which you can customize. So you can set what degree of flooding you are concerned about. You can select the different types of facilities, which is what it's showing you right now. You can click on individual facilities, see the projected flood risk, and get more information about that facility from the original data source. And you can also select different indicators of community marginalization, such as the poverty rate or linguistic isolation, the proportion of people of color living in that neighborhood. So I'll stop there, and thanks again for the opportunity to share.
Thank you, Laura Cushing from UCLA. Yeah, I've been following the Toxic Tides project for a while now. It's great to see this work being done and expanded from California and across the nation. So now we'll have Amanda Fensel from the Union of Concerned Scientists. Welcome, and please start by introducing yourself.
Yep, hi everyone. My name is Amanda Fensel. I joined the Union of Concerned Scientists last December as a senior climate scientist in our Western States program. unmute myself, sorry. And in case you don't know, UCS is a national nonprofit organization, and we combine technical analysis and effective advocacy to help support evidence-based decision-making to address some of the biggest challenges we face today, including climate change. My work as a geographer and environmental social scientist has really always sat at the intersection of environmental justice and climate change. And so I'm really honored to be included amongst this great panel of scholars. And I'm also really looking forward to hearing from the advocates later on. I think one of the questions for today's forum was thinking about how to decide what disproportionate impacts to work on. And I think that the hard part about this question is that we know climate change is producing uneven impacts across both time and space. And what I found in my work is that the ability to adapt to those changes is also really uneven. And so when you think about what impact to prioritize, my point in this slide is really to let communities and water systems lead on any kind of impact prioritization. And I think what you could do as a board is think about setting up a framework by which there is guidance for water systems about which climate extremes or how to do it, and then let them self-determine their priorities. The maps I included on this slide show findings from our household level survey, where we asked respondents how concerned they were about climate change and extreme events on their household water supply. And most, actually 85% of respondents were really concerned about California's future water supply reliability. And there was two big takeaways from that paper. So one, certain extreme events reflected concern at a statewide level. So that first map, letter A, and the second map, letter C, so that's droughts and heat waves. The frequency and severity of those events are always probably going to remain at a statewide level, are going to be a high priority for climate concern. But I think the other thing to consider is that fires, which is this map B, and floods are more place-based and contextual, but they're no less important in terms of thinking about the disproportionate impacts we're going to expect from climate change. And the other key thing that we found in our survey is that the more extreme events someone had experienced or reported to experience, the more concerned they were, with each additional event increasing their odds of being more concerned by more than 80%. And so when you think about this, what that means is building resilience at the community and the water system level to the types of changes they're experiencing and expect to experience, means accounting to the fact that we're going to be seeing extreme events happening one after another or even co-occurring, which really centers the idea of cumulative impacts beyond just prioritizing one impact against each other. And I think the other key point in this slide is the suggestion of, when you think about what impacts to work on and where, is continuing to learn from water systems. I'll get into this on my next slide, but the board has clear regulatory oversight over water systems, and in many cases are already providing them with funding and technical support. And what we learned in our work is that water systems, a lot of them, at least for drought, and I imagine for other climate risks, already know the types of strategies that they need to be pursuing to build resilience, but there's a lot of barriers that remain. So my other thought is that beyond prioritizing impacts, you can also think about removing barriers to adaptation. And to ensure that this is done in a way that centers equity, you can think about expanding existing data collection systems to include equity from an intersectional lens. And so what we did in this survey was intentionally including questions that go beyond the gender binary, for example. So thinking about the existing reporting systems you have, rather than creating new monitoring tactics, I think you can think about ways to integrate, whether it's in the annual electronic reports, the drinking water needs assessment, the new sanitation needs assessment, other data collection systems you already have in place, is being really intentional and inclusive to align the things you care about in this strategy with the kind of impacts you're trying to achieve. Thanks, Chris. And I think, okay, next slide. Okay, so my next recommendation is probably obvious, and I think Shireen hinted at this earlier. There's a lot of money coming in for infrastructure. So making sure that the way the board thinks about infrastructure investments is building climate resilience for water systems in those historically under and disadvantaged communities that are also climate vulnerable. So this means obviously prioritizing safe and affordable water. But part of the reason you have this intersection of climate vulnerability is because of this historic disinvestment. And I think making sure that climate resilience is embedded in the way that you think about infrastructure could get down to your contracts and MOU. This is like in the nuts and bolts of the way you think about your interaction with engineering firms, the scope of the work they have to do, the kind of projects and long-term drinking water solutions the board wants to put into place, can start thinking about and incorporating climate change as part of that. I think the other thing I'll highlight, just because we're close on time, is that this chart here is what I was alluding to in terms of drinking water systems, knowing the types of adaptation and drought responses they want to do. A lot of them have unidentified, identified but unfunded aspirational goals they want to do. And the other thing to note is there's a small portion that don't know what they want to do. So there's a certain level of effort that needs to be put into place for the systems that don't know how they want to adapt. But there's already a lot we know from water systems to think about what needs to happen. And so my last slide is just a bunch of resources. So rather than putting in the chat, you can get them from the slide deck. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda Fensel from Union of Concerned Scientists. So that was our final panelist from the research panel. And in the interest of time, we're going to wait to do questions in the second half of the forum today, just so we can move on to the advocacy panel. And I would like to bring on Michael Mendez from the LA Water Board to introduce himself and also introduce what's going to go on with the panel. So we'll wait for our prepared questions into the second half of the forum. I will also help to ping the presenters when it's about 1 minute in the chat to help with that as well. So Michael Mendez, I hand it over to you. Welcome.
Good afternoon. Again, I'm Mike Mendez. I'm a board member of the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board, and I'm also an assistant professor of environmental policy and planning at the University of California, Irvine. So this has been an amazing panel and historic, also in nature of the State Water Board taking leadership on this issues of equity, diversity, inclusion, and specifically racial equity and an intersectional lens that many of the researchers in the prior panel mentioned. So I thank you for this opportunity, and I really enjoyed hearing about the emerging and an innovative research from the previous panelists. I know most of them and met most of them, so I am a fan of the work that you're doing. So this panel is really going to build off on that significant body of research that's highlighting, documenting, defining, and sometimes making recommendations of how do you have this racial equity, intersectional lens, how do you implement it in water governance, how do you make it operational? So very much like the panel that we had previously, we're going to hear from community advocates that are going to be talking about this issue of operationalizing equity and really understanding that many of these inequities, environmental injustices that we see throughout California are not by accident. They don't happen by coincidence, but they're really baked in our water policy decisions, our infrastructure investments that we have made or withheld from, particularly low-income community of color, farm worker communities, undocumented communities, and tribal communities as well. So again, we're going to hear from each panelist about a 5-minute presentation. And first, we're going to start with Shasta Galgan from the Tribal Climate Health Project, who will be presenting, and Sherry Norris from the California Indian Environmental Alliance, who will be helping with questions in the Q&A portion. So first, let's hear from Shasta. If you can please turn on your camera, and I look forward to hearing your introduction.
Thank you. So hello, everybody. My name is Shasta Gaughan, and I do direct the Tribal Climate Health Project, but my actual day job is I'm the environmental director and the Tribal Historic Preservation Officer for the Paula Band of Mission Indians in Payam-Coachum Territory, a place now called San Diego County, close to the San Diego Riverside County border near Temecula. And I am not Indigenous myself, but I've worked for Paula for over 18 years. And it's been the privilege of my life to be able to do this work on behalf not only of Paula, but other tribal communities and tribal nations throughout California. And I'm delighted to be joined by Sherry Norris, who will also just have a few things to say near the end of my 5 minutes here. So I want to thank the previous panel for talking to us about research and infrastructure and flooding and all these things that are definitely important when it comes to talking about California's water issues. But we're here to talk a little bit more about some of the justice issues, and especially justice and water issues as they relate to California's first people, which is California's tribal nations and the citizens that make up those nations. And you may or may not know that California has more federally recognized tribal nations than any other state in the union except for Alaska. And so we have a large majority, both in terms of number of nations and population. And California's not a place where a lot of people necessarily think about tribes, but there's a lot of them here. And then there's also many non-federally acknowledged tribes in California. So, 5 minutes isn't enough to go into the history of, loss and colonialism that has affected tribes in California. We are where we are today, and the tribal nations are doing what they can to protect their rights to water, their access to water. And unfortunately, there is a history that needs to be talked about when it comes to tribes and justice and water and our access to water, especially in these difficult times of climate change and disruption. I know I have tribal friends and colleagues who were affected by the terrible flooding in the Central Valley and everything that comes with the drought impacts that we see in places like the Owens Valley, where the Paiute people have their ancestral territories, and they struggle with drought and a lack of water because of the fact that the Owens Valley Lake was drained in order to take that water and ship it to Los Angeles. And that's still the case. So that water was taken from those tribes a long time ago, and they had nothing to say about that process, and they had no way to fight back during that time. And so they still continue to struggle for those rights to bring that water back to the Paiute people and to their traditional homelands. For those of us in San Diego County and other places that are dealing with changes to groundwater levels, to climate worsening drought conditions, to the high heat that we're all experiencing, which of course has an impact on our water systems and our access to water and our ability to store water as well. These are all things that we are very concerned about. But we are also concerned about the ability of tribal folks to be able to participate in their traditional uses of different plants and animals and resources that are water dependent. So for example, throughout California, there are people who still make baskets the traditional way, which means that they are going to these waterways that in many instances have been drained or have been diverted for agriculture or are impacted by pesticides or runoff and fertilizer from agricultural operations. And their ability to harvest and use plants for basketry or plants for traditional medicine or even plants for food. You may not know this, but there are many parts of water-based plants like rushes and cattails that actually have edible parts or they have medicinal purposes. And so when those things become impacted by a lack of water, whether it's on tribal trust lands, tribal reservation lands, or tribal ancestral lands, and just to be sure, I want you all to know that every part of California where you're sitting and standing is tribal land. We have to protect those things so that not only tribes have enough to drink for survival, but they're able to maintain their traditional lifeways without making themselves exposed to the pollution that can be a part of waterways. And so I know there's less than a minute, so I just wanted to turn it to Sherry briefly to say a few things, and then we will move on to the next panelist.
Okay, so I'm just going to piggyback off what you said, Shasta. Thank you. So just to remember, the tribes are nations. So tribes are not merely stakeholders. Tribes actually have, oops, there we go. Hi. Tribes actually have constituency that are a membership, just like the federal membership. So for example, myself as a tribal person, I am a citizen of the United States. I'm a citizen of California. I'm a citizen here in the state that or the county that I'm in, and the city that I'm in, and I'm also a tribal nation. And along with that citizenship as a tribal nation member, I have a responsibility. I also have a responsibility just through my family line. So that said, there are many tribes in California that are federally recognized, that are state recognized, and some which are not recognized by either. So when we talk about this process that we're embarking on, we talk about citizens being outreached to as the public. I am a member of the public, and I also have a responsibility as a tribal member. I did hear a lot of people talking about water infrastructure, and for tribes, there's this cultural continuance need that the human right to water, the United Nations treaties, whether that be the Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People or the Convention on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, all of those bodies are trying to support cultural continuance of Indigenous peoples. And really the last thing that I wanted to say that's related to this work is to remember that those responsibilities that we have as tribal people one of our basic tenets is that we help our community. We also help our neighbors and others within our community and within our territories that are not of our membership. And that's really a basic tenet of us as Indigenous peoples. So when we're looking at keeping water in creeks, rivers, and natural lakes, all the way from the source to the ocean, we're looking at trying to, as Indigenous people, trying to increase the resources that are there. So increase the amount of fish, increase the amount of foods, traditional foods that are there, not just for our people, but in hopes that those are foods that others in the California area will be able to benefit from. Right now, when we do talk about equity, we need to make choices of what crops are going to be grown and what natural systems that we're going to provide for and to enable to continue to be there. So when we do talk about removing regulations and removing barriers in order to get more water into our system for drinking water, we also have to think about what those removal of those barriers and those regulations might be doing to California as a whole, which will continue to exacerbate issues related to climate change. For example, I saw someone put something on there about snowpack. Tribes are also, of course, cognizant of that. And there should be some upland meadows that are wetlands that would be slowing the process of the water moving from those areas in the mountains. So that's where we start to look into and need to hear from tribes in each of their traditional territories who have those actionable strategies for helping us in the face of climate change. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Shasta and Sherry. It's a great reminder of acknowledging the historical injustices, or what's often called recognition justice, of these inequities in California and the various impacts that have happened to tribal communities historically throughout the state of California. So next, we're going to be hearing from Chairman Evelyn from the Sierra Club of California. And thank you for coming. I look forward to your introduction.
Hi, everyone. My name is Charming Evelyn, and I am the chair of the Water Committee for Sierra Club California. And before I even get into it, I just want to say I would like to amplify the voices we just heard from the tribal nations, because they are a very important part of California. And they inform a lot of the work that we do, and we really do have to support them in what they're trying to achieve. So going into it, in 2001, Sierra Club, which is a grassroots organization, we're over 132 years old, they made the decision that every issue we look at needs to be looked at through the lens of environmental and social justice. And basically, they adopted 3 environmental principles. We support the right to a clean and healthful environment for all people. We support an end to pollution. We support the precautionary principle. And that informs the work that we do when it comes to water and water equity. Next slide, please. Thank you. Now, typically, folks are wondering, what does environmental justice look like? On the slide here, you see I wrote environmental injustice. What does water and environmental injustice look like? Let's take a look at the Exide communities that were contaminated with lead poisoning. Of course, that contamination is not just relegated to soil. You also have to look at water contamination. We all know about Flint, Michigan. What about housing and homelessness? When we bypass CEQA, what happens? Then we have homes that are built, of course, for mostly brown and Black people on unmitigated brownfields. That is an environmental justice issue. EPA designated Superfund sites. the human right to clean, accessible, affordable water. Something I always bring up, no one ever thinks about, lack of access to water for the unhoused. The people living on the streets, how do they access water? What does sanitation look like for them? What does cooking look like for them? Where are they getting that water? Factories, warehouses, water treatment facilities built in under-resourced communities. When we have meetings like this, so whether it's the water board or the water agency, how many of these agencies put out outreach in different languages? All of these are environmental justice issues. The lack of seen and unseen disability access. What does that look like? So it's not every disability that we can see. Some of them are unseen, and we also have to think about these things when we are looking at equity issues. Failure to engage the public. Of course, we have environmental degradation for wildlife, marine life, flora and fauna. And last but not least, cost. Who benefits and who pays? That is something that's really huge. And we heard earlier, one of the panelists discussing the fact that you have small water agencies that really cannot afford to have repairs or conduct infrastructure repairs because they lack funding. And you're probably thinking, why do they lack funding? Because typically a smaller water agency is only servicing a very small community. Maybe they might have 1,000 service connections, sometimes less. And these are usually in under-resourced, underserved communities where salaries are at a minimum. So, that occurs. Next slide, please. And so one of the things I want to mention is sea level rise and managed retreat. Of course, when folks hear the word managed retreat, especially if you own a home, most people think that's the word for giving up. That means you have to give up your house and your town. And this is something the Water Board and the state of California really has to take a very hard look at, because we are in the area where we have excess flooding and sea level rise. What does that look like for the homeowner? And now with insurances saying we are no longer going to insure you for flooding or sea level rise, that becomes a much bigger issue. And it is something we are not speaking about, but we really have to have a very in-depth discussion on that topic. And so for the folks who do not know what managed retreat means, basically it's saying we have to manage what is occurring. We have to manage the effects of climate change. And how are we going to do that? We have to move more inland. Of course, then you have to think about how do we balance the cost? Folks are going to be losing equity that they have built in their homes. So, we really want to put that out there and have people think about it. And thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to the next panelist.
Thank you for that overview. It's very exciting to hear the work and perspectives and how you conceptualize equity and justice from the Sierra Club. So thank you for that. And I really appreciate your focus on not just focusing on inequitable impacts, but also focusing on benefits. Who benefits from our climate and water governance decisions and grants and programs, and how can we ensure that our investment in infrastructure is more equitable. So thank you for that. Next, we're going to have Justine Massey and Kaija Rivers from the Community Water Center, which I've been a big fan of for many years. I've worked closely with several of your previous staff members, including Laura Firestone at the State Water Board, and of course, Susana de Anda, your current executive director, and many others as well. So thank you, and I look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Kai Rivers. I'm a policy advocate at Community Water Center. I'm also joined with my colleague, Justine Massey, who is a policy manager and attorney at Community Water Center, where our mission is to ensure all Californians have access to safe, clean, and affordable drinking water. Next slide, please. We are projected to hit the first hit 1.5 degrees Celsius of warming by 2027 within the next 4 years. And just this month, we experienced the hottest day on record, with the world record only lasting about 24 hours as we broke that record for the hottest day the following day. That's 2 world records in just 1 weekend. And this is just one symptom of the climate crisis, and disadvantaged communities are on the front lines. Because climate change is a threat multiplier, frontline communities endure many of the extremes that develop as the climate crisis accelerates, such as whiplash from extreme hot and dry conditions to quick and intense wet seasons. Both of these extremes will continue to put communities' drinking water and lives at risk. Droughts are becoming more frequent and longer in duration, causing thousands of wells to go dry, while flooding is further contaminating already impacted wells. Farm worker lives and jobs will continue to be put at risk, and many families will be at risk of losing their livelihood with every looming extreme, or as land goes out of production with dwindling water supplies. Next slide, please. We turn to groundwater during drought, with many communities relying on it for their everyday drinking water needs. And we cannot continue to rely on wishful thinking or allow impacts to fall disproportionately on vulnerable communities under the proposed groundwater levels within groundwater sustainability plans. Up to 12,000 wells or 126,000 people would lose access to this resource. And this is unacceptable, but the State Water Board now has the authority over these plans. Because of this, we must prioritize protecting drinking water resources and communities' access to drinking water as well. Vulnerable communities of color have been historically left without the resources they need to thrive or even survive. And now the State Water Board has the opportunity to place disadvantaged communities at the forefront of climate action. We need to prioritize disadvantaged communities for climate resilient infrastructure investments, along with well drilling and consolidations. This includes green infrastructure investments as well. And the State Water Board should coordinate with agencies to increase land available for recharge and ecosystem support, while also ensuring farm workers are supported during this transition. It's also crucial the board uses its authority to end over-extraction and restore the natural solutions that originally gave us a reliable drinking water supply and provide climate regulation mechanisms. Next slide, please.
Ryan.
Oh, I'm sorry, go back one more slide. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'll pick up where she left off. I'm Justine, hello. We've been asked to weigh in on where it's most strategic for the State Water Board to focus to achieve climate and racial equity. And while funding and monitoring are crucial components, we see your regulating power as most critical. As climate change threatens our ability to survive, we must protect what we have left. Groundwater is our safety net, especially for people of color in low-income communities. For example, between 80 to 90% of the populations in the Central Valley and on the Central Coast rely on it for drinking water. The Sustainable Groundwater Management Act is a piece of enforcing this. And critically important is the statistic that Kaya shared there. Those wells tend to be the shallower wells, which have least contributed to the problem of overdraft and are especially concentrated in disadvantaged communities. Those communities have to come to you to ask for equity, to ask for their human rights. Next slide, please. In parallel regulations like the agricultural order, the State Water Board must limit contamination so that residents are not poisoned by their water. Clean groundwater is a precious, irreplicable resource. Filters and consolidations can only address a certain amount of households, so preserving access to groundwater is crucial. We need clear incentives and enforcement to move us from extractive and synthetic practices to regenerative agricultural strategies rapidly. This also has the benefit of preserving soil health, which promotes groundwater recharge while acting as a carbon sink. The trajectory of an extractive approach, whether directed toward groundwater or fossil fuels, is destructive for all. While we may come across resistance to reining this in, we also know that it's urgently important. SGMA, the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act, exists because residents and farmers alike realized that pumping was outstripping the resource. In terms of the consequences of emissions and unsustainable practices,
Crop failure is already happening due to heat and floods. A small but important example is that grapes lose their sweetness in extreme heat, and thus their value. Workers can't work, and all of this is compounded with larger disasters like homes being destroyed. And through all of this, drinking water is further imperiled. We know that bold action is necessary. So we ask the State Water Board to use your existing regulatory authorities to limit emissions and threats to our resources and focus on what truly constitutes beneficial use as outlined in California's Constitution. It is in the State Water Board's and community's best interest for the board to play a lead role here. For example, is it truly a beneficial use for oil and gas production, which we know is causing climate change, to use massive amounts of groundwater and then release that compromised wastewater directly into the ground? This impacts groundwater availability, groundwater quality, and destabilizes the climate. And similar impacts are seen from unsustainable agricultural practices. Communities can only adapt so much, and drinking water will become more difficult to protect as climate change accelerates. So the time to intervene is now. The people of California need you. And we can move to our final contact slide. Welcome to continue the conversation, and looking forward to further discussion. Thank you.
Wonderful. I really enjoyed that overview and then the focus, particularly on looking at these compounding disasters and the various social and economic ways it's going to impact communities of color, low-income communities as well. So thank you for that reminder and that overview of your work. Next, we're going to be hearing from Rosa Nelson from Nuestra Casa. Thank you and welcome to our panel today. Look forward to your introduction as well.
Hello, thank you so much everyone for being here. My name is Rosa Nelson and I'm the Water Justice Coordinator at Nuestra Casa. I'm going to take you through some of our work and how we are working to advance racial equity in our environmental justice work. Next slide, please. So to give you a little bit of context, Nuestra Casa is in East Palo Alto, which lies in the mid-peninsula of the Bay Area. The city of East Palo Alto is 59.9% Latinx and has a poverty rate of 12%. And this is compared to San Mateo County that has a Latinx population of 12% and a 6.8% poverty rate. East Palo Alto was unincorporated until 1983. Before incorporation, residents do not have the decision-making autonomy and agency of wealthier neighborhoods. Our soil remains contaminated from early land use decisions, such as the Romic Hazardous Waste Facility, which was shut down in 2007. And we are much more vulnerable to climate change than other communities, especially when it comes to sea level rise. So to give you a very quick rundown of our environmental justice programs, we have Promotoras in Community Outreach, an environmental justice academy that helps to educate our community members, food rescue and distribution, as well as water justice. Every program uses the same basic underlying strategy: community engagement, community-driven advocacy, and leadership development. And then our staff, and something I'm very proud of, is that our staff and board are really reflective of the community we serve. And this is because everyone on staff at Nuestra Casa has lived experiences similar to the community members we serve. So why the focus on, and next slide, I'm so sorry. And then one more, sorry about that. Okay, perfect. So why the focus on water? So for years, we had heard from the community as well as our own staff at Nuestra Casa about a mistrust of their tap water and concerns with their water quality. I do want to be clear that the water in East Palo Alto is clean and safe to drink, but we wanted to address the community's concerns and our staff members' concerns. So in 2019, we had the opportunity to work with SFEI to conduct a community needs assessment, which asked a lot of questions, but drilled down on water quality issues. And from the needs assessment, we learned that 75% of respondents drink bottled water. And so there was very clearly a lot of mistrust. So in order to combat that, we implemented a DAC-TIP tap water testing program where we tested the community members' water, and we went to their homes and asked for permission to do this testing to help, alleviate some concerns and to encourage their use of tap water, as well as water filter distribution to, again, encourage the use of tap water instead of water bottles, which are very high cost to our community members, as well as very bad for the environment. And then currently we're working on creating a community water task force, which will allow us to center the community's voices. It's a place for community members to share any concerns, to ask questions, and to receive resources from us and then outside agencies who can help with education. And so this is kind of what we've done to help and to engage our community in this issue of tap water mistrust. And then next slide, please. So while we're doing any of these projects that I just disclosed, and then any other projects, we have our toes in research currently. We really try to center racial equity at the foremost in our community. And so how we're doing that is, first, I like to start with the saying, nada sobre nosotros sin nosotros, which means nothing for us without us. So the community members drive my work. They drive our organization. We want to understand what the community wants to see, what their concerns are, and then that informs the work that I do. And part of that too is making sure that our community members are always informed. So we have trusted community members who perform outreach called promotoras, and they help to dispel information to the community that can be trusted and that is accessible. And this really allows for an underserved community like East Palo Alto to have their voices heard and to get information out. And then also what's really important when we're centering equity, especially in the water, is that we drive the research agenda, which means that we decide who we want to partner with and when we want to partner with someone outside of our community and how we want to do that. So that means making sure that community members, as well as Nuestra Casa, is compensated when there's a research project or when there's any sort of studies or anything being done, and then as well as ensuring that for everything, whether it's a flyer or an event or a research project going on, that the programming is done in both Spanish and English, and that there are always translators, and that our community members always feel like everything is accessible. So as the State Water Board drafts its climate and racial equity strategy, I encourage you to center underserved communities when creating any sort of policy or program framework. These are the people whose voices have been unheard for far too long. So to really achieve equitable water access for all across the state, there needs to be a focus on our underserved communities. And next slide. That's just the end. That's the end of my presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Rosa, for that. And your presentation really highlighted the importance of community engaged, community action and research of amazing nonprofits like yourself, and educating the public, community residents, and community leaders about capacity building around environmental governance issues and equity. So thank you for that. We've heard from a fabulous and important group of advocates and policy experts. And I believe we're going to be going into a short break, and Molly will take us into that break, and we'll have an opportunity for questions and answers from the entire group of researchers, as well as community members and groups as well. So look forward to that. Molly.
Awesome. Thank you, Mike. So we're only about 4 minutes behind right now, but we're going to go ahead and take a 10-minute break until 2:49, or let's say 2:50. We'll restart. And as Mike mentioned, people are adding questions into the Q&A, so feel free to, as you're taking a little bio break here, ponder those, put them in the Q&A, and we will see you back here at 2:50. All right, welcome back, everybody. If you can hear me, come on back to your computers. Hopefully everyone was able to let all that amazing information sink in as we head into our panel discussion. So I'll now pass it back to Chris and Mike to lead us through the panel discussion.
Great, welcome back, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here and co-moderate our Q&A with Chris. Again, I'm Mike Mendez. I'm a board member of the Los Angeles Regional Water Quality Control Board and a faculty member at UC Irvine. So we had a unique opportunity to hear from two very distinct panels, but talking about these water equity and justice issues separately, but here together, we're trying to hear a little bit about the interaction that these individuals have out in the field and sort of wanting to have them speak in conversation with one another. So we have the first question that I'll kick off is for the advocates. We would like to know what is a helpful insight from the research panel that you think aligns with what you experience with communities or policy. So what is useful that some of these water researchers are putting forward, and does that really coincide with the work that you're doing on the ground?
Probably going to have to call on one of us.
Sure. Chasta, if you would like to go first. And
I'm always happy to break the ice. So, I want to thank the research panelists for what they do. And, it can be hard when you're on the advocacy side of things to pull back and look at the research, at least it is for me, without thinking about all the ways that research can potentially affect the community that I'm responsible for and just the access to water in general. So, part of my reaction is a little bit of oh my gosh, we're doing all this research on how we can move the water and put it in channels and make sure that it only goes to these certain places that are basically those policies and those research programs, to me, are developed in the interest of capitalism. And so I'm flying my communist flag high here today. And the thing is, we still need to do the research. I do think we need to do the research to find out where are we going in the future? What is the climate going to be like? What is the water budget going to be like from a hydrologic perspective, not from a state perspective? Where is it going to come from? How are we going to keep it clean and safe and accessible? That's where I want to see the research go. I would like to see more of the research on something that was put into the chat, where somebody talked about when are we going to be talking about doing things the way they used to be done, the way our grandmothers used to do it. Can we do some research on that, on how individuals can do more? But not just individuals. I'm less worried about individuals than I am about the system. And I'm an anthropologist by training, so I'm always thinking about how can we change the culture? Let's do that research on changing the culture so that water has the significance that it should, because water is life. We know that from tribes and indigenous people. And, let's do some research on that. So it's not just about how can we grow more in places where we never should have been using this much water in the first place. I would just like to see how we can move forward in a way that doesn't just replicate the current system. And I will rant about this until the end of time. So I'm just going to stop myself there and let the rest of the advocacy folks chime in.
No, thank you. And thank you for breaking the ice and really emphasizing not to replicate what is already done. Many communities are tired of being studied. Many people don't want to see research that just collects dust on the shelf, but are action oriented, science into action. And it has a strong basis for community to be involved. Anyone else would like to answer this question before we go to the next one?
I have one. The questions that we ask when we do surveys often can guide us towards the direction that the policy makers may or may not want us to get to. So I guess I'm saying that it would be good for you to have an advisory committee to review your survey questions that you're asking, so that we can see what kinds of answers you might inadvertently be blocking us from receiving. For example, I really like to see what answers communities have that are actionable that would get us to having more water for sharing.
And we'll go to Charmy next, but I just want to add, Sherry, what you say is quite important in terms of having community engaged research practices that are ethical and equitable. At the same time, that sometimes there's criticism that researchers come into the community with preconceived ideas of what they already want to study. And it's sort of a check the box when you talk to the community groups. And there's actually oftentimes no co-production of the research questions, gathering of research data, working together, the sharing of research funds as well. So taking that in mind. So Charmy.
Yeah, and I completely agree with Sherry on that point. What I thought was very informative was when Sam referred to the workers as invisibles. There are a lot of invisible people around us that, we don't see. A lot of us never think about. It's one of the reasons I stress so much on the unhoused. And of course, for Sherry and I are old pals. Sherry knows this. I'm always saying we need to amplify our tribal voices. These are also invisible voices that you don't see. They are not invited to have a seat at the table. When it comes to the research, I am open to the research. I love to read the research, and it informs what we do and how we do it. It's not all the time we may agree with the research. However, it does provide a point of reference. So just, a quick example, I was at the Coastal Commission last week, California Coastal Commission, and there was a project where they want to build a hotel and housing, and they say they will have some affordable housing, yet it is right next to a California Superfund site. So, and in the coastal zone. So when you have research for sea level rise, that kind of thing, or disadvantaged communities, I don't like to use the word disadvantaged, I prefer to say under-resourced communities, that information for me is highly valuable because it can inform an argument. When I see research that has how much money people are making compared to the price they're going to sell a home, for instance, or the price of water, when we take a look at Ocean Desal at over $2,000 an acre, that informs decisions. So for me, the research is crucial in informing what we do.
Great, thank you. Anyone? I think Justine wanted to say something.
Yeah, thank you. I just really think it's powerful to see sociological research and STEM research inform each other. For example, there's this incredible need to truly understand and take to heart why it is that underserved communities need to be proactively favored and factored into decision-making, because their voices have been actively and passively hushed, and their resilience has already been drained to the breaking point. So meeting in the middle with other interests just isn't going to be equitable. And I think the more we look into, history and, as I said, sociological research, the deeper our understanding of that. And then having, the kind of STEM research help us to understand the scale of the problem. We are currently leaving the range of global temperatures that have existed on Earth for the past 10,000 years, which is the total of human civilization. And by 2100, we're set to leave the range that has existed for the past 100,000 years, which is the total of time that the human species, as we know it, has been on the planet. So in facing that kind of threat, we need state staff to be willing to push back against the pressures and systems that are leading us towards that collapse. And if you'll bear with me, I want to make some kind of corny metaphor here about being salmon that are willing to swim upstream along with all of these residents and vulnerable communities, including non-human communities that are already having to swim upstream. So being willing to face those pressures and really make a difference.
Thank you for that. And I'll hand it over to Chris for the next question.
Great, thank you. And before we go on to the next question, we just wanted to see how many folks in the audience would like to ask a question live. If you could use the I believe it's in the reaction raise hand feature. So you might have it on the bottom of your Zoom screen with the 3 dots more and then raise hand. And I'm showing you how I'm raising my hand. We just want to get a sense of how many people in the audience today would like to share their question verbally. And then while you're doing that, we'll go on to the next question. And of course, we have the chat and the Q&A feature, which is also a button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And so we'll move on to the next question. So this question is for the researchers, kind of going on kind of the reverse question here.
Recording in progress.
The reverse question here is, researchers, what is a helpful insight from the advocacy panel that you think aligns with what you've seen in research? And we still want to give an opportunity for any from the advocacy panel if they also want to comment, but feel free to unmute yourself from the researcher panel to share your response.
So in my case, something that really resonated was, well, all of the advocates, I do think First Nation first. So, I mean, there is no way around. The other one is what Rosa mentioned, that it should be co-produced, research, it should be think in conjunction. I do think that is extremely important. Also, to think that we need to put the communities and the communities' interest first. I don't know, sometimes I find very disheartening that we have a lot of researchers doing some exotic research some other place, but we have places with similar, even worse conditions here. So I think that also what Amanda mentioned. Amanda also mentioned that we have to put some of the water systems needs or that they have already identified some of those. I think we can have a good list, but still water agencies, and also try to bring the people in the community that are affected by those water agencies to co-produce, to put the priorities in front. I think that will be important. This panel is actually quite interesting, and I feel very honored to be here with all of you.
Thank you. I think this idea of co-production is really important, kind of producing between, let's say, us as a state entity, advocate groups, and researchers. How can we look into co-production? Of course, co-production takes longer, but hopefully there are longer lasting effects and advantages for communities. And so co-production, as far as my understanding, is when different organizations or different types of organizations and institutions work together to produce something together. That could be policy, that could be infrastructure. I felt like I saw Laura Cushing.
Yeah, I mean, this advocacy panel was so fantastic and amazing to hear from. And I think what really resonated with me is just the wealth of expertise held by communities in California with lived experience of diverse water insecurity related impacts, right? That we have so much expertise and lived experience on the ground that needs to ground this work. And so in terms of the research project that I shared, we saw that play out in how the research, it improved the research to have the community partners engaged all along from the start to the finish of the project in very specific ways in terms of informing the questions that we were asking. So kind of looking at this rather unexplored topic that was of relevance to communities living on the fence line of industry who are concerned about future flood risk due to sea level rise. So like helping ensure we're asking the right questions, that the methods are rigorous. So in our case, community partners helped kind of ground truth the data, make sure we decide what types of facilities to include in the analysis and to look at the data and see what was missing in terms of important neighborhood potential contamination sources. And then the reach of the work, like, making the data available in these different formats, making sure that it doesn't just kind of live on a shelf, but it is poised to influence decision-making and local efforts towards climate resilience. So a lot of what was said really resonated with me, and I think just highlights the importance of engaging with affected communities in any research effort.
It looks like you would like to chime in.
Thanks, Chris. I really resonated with what Sherry said about preserving our wetlands, especially as the snowmelt is living with the increased temperatures and our increased snowpack. Something that we're really supportive of at Community Water Center is really enhancing our natural systems to both mitigate climate change and to also act as a way to restore groundwater levels. So this is something that has been supported by the community partners that we regularly meet with from the Central Valley and the Central Coast, using means of making our soil healthier, trees, regenerative agriculture, systems to preserve or restore our natural systems to mitigate climate change. So if any way State Water Board could support in that, that would be great. Really want to echo that.
Great. So I think we have time for one more question. And I want to add a broader question for those out there that may not be familiar as much with the water justice or environmental justice space. So there's been a lot of talk about climate change and racial injustices. And maybe we could talk a little bit more about that. Is climate change the cause of these inequitable impacts, or is there structural inequities that are at the root of impacts?
It's not climate change. Let me just jump in there. Why not? And of course, climate change is having an impact on what resource availability is, but it's climate change did not create the systems that made it less possible, less likely, less easy for people to access the water that they need. And somebody put in the chat, I think, that it's amazing that we even have to talk about access to water as a human right. Of course, it's a human right. Why the heck are we even having to write that down? It reminds me of that. I'm going to get this wrong, but like when you ask a fish to describe water, like how do you even do that? How do you ask us to describe air? The things that we should be able to take for granted. We can't take it for granted because the system is such that these things have been taken away. And so to bring it into an example from the region in which I work, the Kumeyaay tribes in the southern part of San Diego County, Kumeyaay, Ipai, Tipai, named Degeno by the Spanish missionaries because it was Mission San Diego, therefore the people were called Degeno. Those Kumeyaay people were enslaved by the missionaries so that they could build many things. One of them was an aqueduct on the San Diego River to the mission in San Diego's still named Mission Valley. And just for baseball fans out there, when is somebody going to make the connection between the Padres baseball team, of which I am a lifelong fan, and the fact that our team's mascot is a raping colonizer? Just think about that a little bit. Anyhow, sorry for any fans out there. My point is that the colonial system from the get-go was taking the tribes and using them to create the labor, to divert the water, to enforce a system that comes from this value of dominion over the land rather than living at one with it and at the natural capacity, the carrying capacity that land allows, along with the more the traditional, what we now call traditional ecological knowledge or traditional indigenous knowledge or indigenous science ways of managing the land so that it was able to support people at a certain level. You didn't see the tribes of Arizona, for example, or our desert tribes in California trying to, exceed their carrying capacity in the way that we do today. The Phoenix metro area now has more than 5 million people. That is a crime against nature. And I think that the same is true for a lot of the things we're doing with water here in California. And that system needed to be fixed regardless of whether climate is driving any exacerbations of the water crisis. I'm calling on you, Charming.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. Excellent introduction to this question. Thank you for a response that is.
So
yes.
I would say, we say something at Sierra Club. There is no climate justice without social justice. There must be social justice for us to even get to the point where we actually have climate justice. And what Shasta said was correct. Again, when you have the invisible people, the people who are working 3-4 jobs, who cannot attend, a public meeting that's during the day or city council meeting that's during the day because they're working very hard for them to make ends meet, when do they get to have a seat at the table? And of course, when a huge project is being planned in the area, what typically happens? You have, the big companies that bus out folks to come and support the project, and the people who actually live there have no voice. So that is an issue. And, I always encourage, and the water board has heard me say so, when you're going to keep public meetings, you have to keep them in the evening when people are coming from work, and provide some food and provide some childcare. These are things that, folks don't think about. Or you have the meeting on a weekend. Yes, it's inconvenient for office staff. However, it is convenient for the community you are trying to reach. And that is extremely important.
Great, thank you. Anyone else like to add a response, that is? Hi, Amanda.
Yeah, hi. I'll just say, this is a half-baked thought, but I want to sort of center this idea. I think I was using infrastructure as sort of a passing word. And I think this conversation and the voices we heard in the advocacy panel is really, I think, suggesting that this is a much more inclusive thing for the board to be considering. I think this is also a really important moment. There's not a lot of other states that are wrestling with these challenges at the same time in such a public way. And I think it's an important moment to lead by example and make sure we're centering all the voices of the First Nations and environmental justice organizations, and think about infrastructure and the way that the board wants to do its business and implement this strategy as being green infrastructure, cultural infrastructure, social infrastructure. That's much more expansive in thinking about pipes connecting houses. It's a much bigger conversation than just checking boxes to make sure you're not just making vulnerability worse in different places. So I'll close there.
Great, thank you. Anyone else? Oh, I think Rosa.
Yeah, I just wanted to go off of Amanda's comments that were amazing. Just the importance of relationship building for the State Water Board and making those community connections. We are so excited to be involved in the process and want to get our community involved, but just the importance of really making those connections. I work with Khalid on some projects, and it first came about because I kept asking questions to him that we got from the community, and then that relationship formed, and now we're doing some research that's community driven. So just kind of the process and the change that can come out from community relationship building that can create trust and respect is just really, from what I've seen, transformational. So just if that's something the State Water Board can keep in mind.
Great. Thank you for that. And then really acknowledging that context and history matters. I think everyone has really talking about the need for community engagement, the need to have historical background, or I guess what they term recognition justice is. How can you really tackle some of these issues that are happening in our state around water issues if we don't know our history and we don't know the structural inequities or systemic inequities that cause the various socioeconomic and cultural injustices, and how climate change is worsening those issues. So moving away from the reductive framing of climate change impacts to understanding it more contextually and historically. So thank you for that. And then I'm going to pass it on to Molly, who will introduce the next section of this webinar. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Do we want to take a couple hands right now or save those towards the end?
Yeah, why don't we take the questions sort of who in the order they were asked. But first, I'm James Knockbauer, waterboard staff. I'm the director of the Office of Research and Performance here, and I've been working to set up and facilitate this. Before we go to the Q&A, I just wanted to thank the panelists and moderators for their great work on this. It's been really wonderful to hear such a range of perspectives and different takes on ways people are engaging. So yeah, now this is the part of the agenda. We are trying to expand the conversation and hear from more people. But as Chris mentioned, we are still at the start of this CARES process. And so beyond the Q&A now, there will be more opportunities to keep these conversations going. So our focus now is hearing from people who wish to speak. We're listening for recommendations, for thoughts on what kind of analysis would help or what questions should be asked, for perspectives on what's possible or what should be prioritized. And we're all going to be reflecting on what we hear. In general, though, we may not be able to respond right away. This is out of respect for the complexity we're engaging with here. And this complexity includes organizational complexity. As Chris mentioned at the beginning, the water boards have very significant roles in the water sector, but the water boards are just some of the many organizations with roles to play. Also, before going to the hands that are raised, I'll say to my board colleagues, we want to hear from you too, if you have questions or comments, but please make space for others to go first. And if there's time, we may turn to our board colleagues. So yes, please raise hands. Looks like we've got 4 hands raised. Denise?
I think our first raised hand is Kathy Buchanan.
Oh, sorry. It looks like, yes, Kathy Buchanan. Yeah, if you wouldn't mind introducing yourself and any organizational affiliation, that would be helpful.
Good afternoon. I'm with North Coast Native Protectors Tribal Marine Collaborative. My background is environmental resources engineering, chemistry, and I have a master's in biology ecology. The research that has been done, it sounds like it's really great. And I would like to know how the Water Board is going to implement further research into actually being able to conduct an accurate water budget. Because in the current water budget that I saw that was published at the Tribal Water Summit in Sacramento just recently, it did not include the water losses from the bottling companies, from clear cutting activities, the surface mining activities, open pit mining activities, the abandoned mine shafts, the abandoned oil wells, and also the when is the Water Board going to address the non-regulated consumptive uses for corporate agricultural fields that continue to use flood irrigation? All of those activities are notorious in our pine forests that are run by the U.S. Forest Service. And pine trees have a deep root system, which goes down 75 feet underground, which means that they get their water from the aquifers. Those aquifers the hydrology is actively being changed all the time whenever somebody clear cuts, and it's being drained. The aquifers are being drained whenever somebody cuts a hole into the aquifer, such as an open pit mine. If you've passed by a big, huge pond where an open pit mine used to be, that water comes from somewhere. especially when California is notorious for having a cycle of 10-year droughts. If it doesn't rain very significantly, where is that water coming from? It is coming from the mountains. So how can the water board get research done to actually adequately account for a water budget with all of those losses included? Because that will give us the groundwater feeds our rivers, it feeds our tributaries, it supports the salmon and other wildlife. So we need to have that done. When can groundwater quantity be taken seriously by the water board? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. You're touching on a lot of topics there. Could you speak more about, when you say water budgets, you mean the ones informing?
The water budget is basically all of your inputs and all of your outputs. So your input primarily would be your snow, your rain, any other thing, and your outputs would be any activities on the land, your water uses for municipal water uses, so on and so forth. So, I mean, we've had, I made a comment in the chat about a lot of people believe that this past year for our snowfall is 130% of normal. Well, when I asked I forget his last name, his name is Eric, he's from the BLM, and I asked him in reference to historical snow levels from like 40 years ago, what was our snow level for this year? And he said that it was probably just at 100%. So we really haven't had 130%. It was only 100%. This year was actual normal of what we got. And the reason why it seems like so much more is because during the interim of the 30 years that we had, a lot of people have been building up in those mountains. They haven't had to deal with the type of snowpack that they have, that they got this year. So that's why it was a surprise. So that's what I mean by the water budget. It's like where you have to have your two sides, your inputs is supposed to be equal to your outputs. And right now our outputs exceed our inputs, and a lot of people, it seems like their studies are based upon, San Francisco's being Northern California. Northern California goes all the way up to the Oregon border, and people are forgetting that. California is a huge state. I don't live anywhere near San Francisco. I live 15 minutes south on the Oregon border. And then there's also east of the coastal mountains that a lot of people are forgetting. We've had 4 huge fires here that are nowhere near any of the areas that are being considered for these studies. So how can we make these studies more accurate to consider the various zones that people live in?
Yeah, thank you. I think this speaks very much to the importance of research and empirical information to looking both backwards at the hydrology in California, but also looking ahead to how heat, for example, is going to affect Sierra. I think as we continue to work here in this framework, one of the questions we're thinking about a lot is among the different kinds of climate impacts or climate threats, like which ones, how to compare them, how to integrate them, how to think about the diversity of climate impacts, both direct impacts and indirect ones. And absolutely, I think the availability of water, the water budgets, how climate change is going to make things hotter, and how that's going to change snowpack and hydrology. These are really key issues for further research. Yeah, thank you. Fred Briones.
Hello? Oh, yes. Hi. Thank you again for putting this care package together, this meeting for all the agencies online and the tribal peoples online. My name is Fred Briones, I'm a tribal member at the Big Valley Rancheria, Band of Pomo Indians. I'm a basket weaver, and also I'm a old water treatment operator. And for our tribe, leadership, our leadership comes from water. And you'll hear many tribes speak that water is life. There was a question by Michael. He asked if there were any challenges that tribes or systems that were in place um, that to prevent tribes from advancing, especially in the water. Here we talk today. And one of the things that the state of California has done to tribes is in 1958, they passed the California Rancheria Act, which took away all of the land and water right holdings to the tribes. And my tribe was one of those tribes. But then in 1984, the state gave back our lands, but then they never gave back our water. And we could see why, because to non-Indians, I want to say European farmers, water is money, water is gold, water is profit. That's how they speak. So then you could see how important that this meeting is today. This because we care, but those others that don't care, how could we further engage them into these conversations of conservation? It's challenging, and it's that mindset that we must do to preserve the earth and preserve our water. So, for example, in Lake County, where our water was healing, had so much healing properties, where people all over California would come to our lake, learn our songs and our dance and heal in our waters. But then, of course, our water was stolen from us. And then now to see how our water is being used in Lake County specifically for wine production, it really has this effect on the environment, where we're seeing our fish, our hitch, a native species to our lake, die. Its population is significantly decreasing, that it is put on the state endangered species list. We're trying to get endangered species status from the feds. In 2025, that will come up. But our water for wine and alcohol is not our culture. And we're trying to have our water for healing. So a lot of recognizing what the state has done and what the state prioritizes their water for agriculture in urbanization, but agriculture where financial system of loans, insurance was given to these farmers and none to the natives. It was all taken from us. I would like to say, me personally, I am one of the first slaves, a descendant of a slave in the gold mines of California and also the farms of California, Vallejo's farms my family worked on. And on those farms, those are the ones using the water. In those farms, they have used the natives as slaves. They have used the Black people as slaves. They have used the Asian people as slaves. And now they use the Latino. So these farmers, they really need to be checked. A lot of their water is unregulated, unmanaged, where they can just produce as much water, pump as much water as they wish from the ground, from the reservoirs, from the lakes, especially our lake. Now they look at our lake as if it's the private liquor barrel reserve. And that's just so shameful because, again, alcohol is not our culture and we must do something about it. So my tribe we're filing some paperwork with some of our attorneys because we want change immediately to get back our water rights. We strongly feel that we have a good case and we hope we can get more support from the state in realizing what they have done to native tribes in this day and climate change to mitigate will be to have more water, not for agriculture, but for plants, for birds, for animals, for the fish, and there will be abundance. So if we want to make some change in our lifetime, please adjudicate tribal water rights. That is my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing that. I think you're speaking to central and important issues, and I think we're doing a lot and trying to do more to reflect and incorporate different equity perspectives, history, and working to ensure that there is water for all different uses here in California. Thank you very much for your comments. Specifically regarding water rights and adjudication, the board can't issue an adjudication on its own motion. And so until we receive a petition to do so, no adjudications take place. I hope that's helpful. Looks like we have more hands up. Why don't we turn to Horacio Amezquita.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, my name is Horacio Amezquita. I'm from the Salinas Valley. I live and work in the community of San Gerardo for about 40 years, 50 years. A lot of things, psychological and health issues, which nobody pays attention to it. Some of the people, they just have problems with their skin. Some of them, they have cancers. Mostly they were farm workers and their families that built that community. So they went through bottled water, filtration systems. They got some grants and they got a well that was 2 miles away. It was the only place they can find clean water. But the community wanted to get some loans from the bank. They were not allowed to get loans because the water was contaminated. They lost a lot of opportunities in paying loans. The way the communities, the way they have to wait in order to clean water, to get clean water is 10, 20 years, 30 years. Some communities, 40 years, because they don't have the means to repair the damage. And sometimes there's no more clean water to repair the damage. The droughts, the farmers, they use 90% of the water. And when the drought comes, like last year, they have to go over the threshold on the aquifers, because if they don't, they're not going to put any water on the crops. So because of that, the levels of nitrates and arsenic and other chemicals, they go up because you're lowering the aquifers. With the floods, the community doesn't even have access to the roads because there's a lot of erosion from the fields. The sediments go into the creeks and to the river. So pretty soon you have a big damage of erosion in all waterways. You also have contamination with pesticides, herbicides, fumigants, rodenticides, any type of pesticide. And they also drift into the community, causing cancer, asthma, and other sicknesses that are not accounted. So with the floods, you got high insurance policies. With wildfires, you have high insurance policies that communities have to face. So my question to everybody is, this community that I live and that I work for many years has faced all kinds of inequities, injustices. And when they finally got a $6 million grant from the State Water Board and the Obama administration, and they have clean water 2 miles away from the community. And the mitigation of synthetic fertilizers and pesticides is not, it hasn't been faced. It has not been regulated. So this pollution continues to other communities, and if that well, the new well that is coming 2 miles away, gets contaminated, it used to be 3 points on nitrates and arsenic, and now sometimes it goes over 8.5 on both. And it has not been tested before the rains, so it could already been over the limits. So my question to all of you, if that well gets contaminated and the community has to start all over again, back since 1990, who's going to pay? Who's going to pay for the damage of health issues to the community, the deaths that people die of cancer, and all the psychological things that the community has to go through just because we over exploit the water, we over exploit the soil, we pollute the air with so much pesticides that are drifting into schools that mostly are Latinos. So how are we going to make California more suitable to live for everybody? So thank you for listening.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing. That's very, very important, I think, as we proceed. I'm very interested in ways we can incorporate the cumulative impacts that are affecting communities, the direct and indirect impacts that are affecting communities, and that we're not thinking about things in too isolated a way. So yeah, thank you. So looks like we have one more hand up. I'll also invite our panelists and moderators, if they wish to chime in. Please also raise your hand, or you can send me a Zoom chat. Hello, Ramirez. If you could unmute, please. And
hello, y'all. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi, my name's Hilo Ramirez. I am the environmental director for the Mechoopda Indian Tribe of Chico Rancheria. We're located in Butte County, California. I had a question for Amanda. If my memory serves me correctly, you presented on the climate survey data, correct? Okay. So I'm going to give some background information, so hopefully my question makes sense. So Butte County and the Mechoopda Tribe's reservation actually was burnt in the Camp Fire. 85 people died, and there was about 15 or 20 injuries, and that was in 2018 or so. And then right after that, we were hit by the North Complex Fire and the Dixie Fire, which are the largest fires in California history. So we've been ravaged by wildfires for the last 5 years, but on your map, of wildfire concerns in the survey, there wasn't a single dot for Butte County. So I was wondering if there's some confounding variables at play here, or if it's reflective of underrepresentation in your survey, because I noticed the Bay Area had a whole bunch of dots for wildfire, but not a single dot in the whole area that's been hit the worst by wildfire in the last 5 years. So is it reflective of underrepresentation within the Butte County, Plumas County area, or reflective of confounding variables where if you phrase a question and say climate change, being a resident and being grown up here, I know Northeastern California is more conservative than the rest of the state. So with my conversations with individuals, if you talk about wildfire and talk about like different weather patterns, people are on board. But as soon as you say climate change or global warming, they'll say, oh, that's not real. So I was wondering if you think it's reflective of the words that you're using, or just it didn't get out to our region, because I find it hard to believe that no one in the Butte, Plumas County area thinks that wildfire isn't a threat.
Yeah, so I'll just quickly say there's definitely a sampling issue with that particular survey. It was a household level survey that was run at a Cal State, so we didn't have control over where it went and the respondents. But I'll say in other work I've done where we surveyed water system managers and interviewed water system managers, like the Butte County concerns are definitely highlighting the wildfire risks. So that's definitely like one of the challenges of doing research. You have these sort of like unknown issues where you can't actually hear from everybody that you want to. But that also is a good cautionary tale to be like relying on survey data only tells you so much. Like interviews, focus groups, these kinds of spaces really help contextualize what you're understanding from the data. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, no, that's what I was thinking. I remember someone else mentioned earlier, part of environmental injustice is the way that surveys are done and who you're able to reach and who you can't reach because of things. So I'll stop talking now, but thank you.
And I would just add,
Chris.
I would just add the importance of ground truthing any of the climate data. Sometimes there are different results from the climate models that show either wildfire or other events occurring at different probabilities. And so really, to get the most accurate data, you need to go down to actually that place and to see what is actually going on there.
Great, thank you. Deirdre Desjardins.
So this is Deirdre Desjardins. I'm with Climate Action California. That's a network of climate advocacy groups and California Water Research. And I just wanted to pass on to people. I really looked into what happened with the greatly reduced runoff we had, and we had greatly reduced snow runoff in 2021 and 2022. And it's because the forests are drying out and they're sucking more water from the root zone in the Sierras. And there's actually shown by the US Geological Survey spent a decade developing a basin characterization model that's really comprehensive, and it characterizes the whole interaction between the atmosphere and temperature and humidity and the kind of vegetation or trees that are there, as well as how much water goes into recharging groundwater and how much goes into runoff. And the same factors it showed, and I think it's really stunning, the same factors that are causing reduced runoff from snow in the lower Colorado River Basin are also causing reduced runoff during dry and critically dry years in the Sierra. So, and it also showed where they have this climatic water deficit and where it shows the forests in California normally take water from the root zone in the summer, but our summers, the onset of the rainy season is now delayed by almost a month. So even in normal years or above normal years. So the forests are sucking more water out of the root zone and they just dry out. And particularly in these droughts, you can get this cumulative water deficit, and it's where that's highest the USGS found that's where we're getting the forest fires. So someone brought this up, and it's kind of technical, but I think it's a profound importance to communities. And the model also shows there may be a transition from forest to oak woodland. Where we have grassland, it'll be desert, and it models that kind of transition. And I think I'd love to see the water board, and I don't know if anyone else on the panel has experience with those kind of models. The studies do account for groundwater in the root zone, and actually they found that forests have their roots very deep into fractured bedrock, and they actually pull water all the way out of the bedrock. And all the forests together in the Sierras, it's been shown by the USDA Forest Service Research Center, they transpire as much water per year as all the reservoirs in California. So I can get you more information, but there is a model. It just hasn't been used. And I'd love to see the water board use it, or some of the folks here. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for sharing. Yeah, that's a great illustration of how technically complex a lot of these are, and also the challenge of integrating some of that technical information into decision making, into partnership, into policy change. So thank you. Okay, it looks like our last hand up is Stephanie Harlan.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Oh, good. Thank you. I just wanted to thank all of you for all your good work. I am a retired nurse from 32 years, and I'm a fairly recent board member on Region 3 from Santa Barbara County to San Mateo County. And I want to especially thank the Sierra Club for all their work, and the Community Water Center in Watsonville for all of their good work in the free testing of the wells in the area, which are highly polluted with nitrates and TCP. And we're working on another problem next week with the San Luis Obispo Airport, with their use of the foam from the firefighters, that they have to conduct regular testing at the airport. And it has polluted between 50 and 60 wells in the adjacent area. And so we're going to be dealing with that next week. So I just wanted to say hello, I'm here, and thank you very much for all of your good work. This was very, very interesting, and I really like being on the water board. It's really good work. I previously served as the chair of the Santa Cruz County Sanitation District, so I'm aware of sanitation district issues. And I was on the Monterey Bay Sanctuary Advisory Council, which dealt with water quality issues from boats and their leaking oil, and a number of other issues. But anyway, I really appreciate it, and I've learned so much. Thank you very much.
Great. No, thank you, Board Member Harlan. Okay, well, I'm going to hand things back to Chris at this point.
There's did you want to speak? Smith Kadara from Region 5? I saw your hand come up a couple times, and I saw you earlier this afternoon too. So just let us know if you'd like to chime in. Otherwise, we can pass it back to Chris.
All right, let's see here. All right, we'll go on ahead. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, audience. Thank you for sharing, interested parties that have joined us. We are really grateful for you being here. Molly, if you could put up that poll, and we'll do that before we end here. So Molly, could you explain the poll?
Yeah, so I just launched a poll for us to get a sense of what type of engagement options you're partial to that you would like to see as a follow-up as we go through the implementation of the strategy. Oh, awesome. Looks like people are already responding. Yeah, so our options are having a speaker series, having smaller focus groups, larger community forums, workshops with board members, or our typical standard board meetings. So we also have a little bit of a longer survey for you to fill out if you would like, so we can get some more of your feedback. And Chris can talk about that.
Yeah, while this Zoom poll is going on, I'll put in the chat a longer feedback form if you'd like to give more detailed feedback, and I'll put it in the chat here. That is, as you see on the screen, tinyurl.com/SWB Climate Forum 2023. You can also use the QR code to get to that form for the forum. And so we'd love to hear back from you in this longer form by the end of tomorrow. So just to have that, your feelings and ideas fresh, and you can get back to us with that form. But otherwise, you can feel free to email our climate team at climate@waterboards.ca.gov, especially if you're part of an organization that would like to be more involved with climate-related events and activities at the State Water Board. Also, please subscribe to the climate email list at waterboards.ca.gov/climate, and you'll see a little window toward the middle of the website that says stay informed and email subscription list. You can put your email right there. All right, Molly, I'll bounce it back to you to see the results of the poll.
Great. It looks like speaker series came out on top. It seems like we really all enjoyed having such an incredible array of panelists and guests today with so many incredibly valuable perspectives. So we look forward to more events like this in the future. And I think we said it earlier as well, but this is intended to be the first of many such events on the path of CARES.
Yeah, I'll echo that. This is super helpful feedback as we think about how to keep this conversation going. These are all good options, and we'll be thinking about how we can best keep the conversation going.
Great. Again, I put the links in the chat. The first one is for the feedback form, and the second one is our climate website at the State Water Board. All of the comments and input today will inform the initial development of the State Water Board Climate and Racial Equity Strategy. We aim to have follow-up public events like we've been talking about. We've got the input from this quick poll on Zoom and also in the feedback form. And all feel free to email our team directly at climate@waterboards.ca.gov again. And you can subscribe to the email list, contact us. The forum video will be posted in English and Spanish on our climate website. So I put that climate website in the chat. Again, we are very grateful to our speakers, panelists, staff, moderators, as well as all of you who have joined us today. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks everyone so much. Take care.
Thank you.